company which was involved in bringing out this molecule, starting from the preclinical till the completion of phase 3. We're waiting with bated breath. But unfortunately, this drug did not receive FDA approval in spite of having completed several large-scale trials, and the drug finally ended up being a failure. It was touted to be one of the drugs that could probably make a strong impact in heart failure treatment, but that was not meant to be. This meant several millions of dollars wasted, and this meant several years of work going down the drain. This is not something that is very unique, but this is, I can say, a very common affair, particularly in the field of cardiovascular drug development. So if you look at cardiovascular disease, it is, all of you know very well that it is still considered the leading cause of mortality worldwide. There was a time when they would say cardiovascular disease is a disease more that is there in the Western population, and when it comes to India, countries like India, it is more about infectious diseases. But today it is no more the case. We all know this, that change in diet, the change in lifestyle, all that has made India as much a major player and contributor towards this lifestyle disease, cardiovascular disease. And today, even in developing nations, not only India, even many other developing nations, cardiovascular disease is the top killer disease, the leading cause of mortality. It is said that heart disease and stroke will result in an estimated 24 million deaths worldwide by 2030. Increasing CVD prevalence is seen in the developing countries, as I told you. And this is more a problem because we also have other issues like a lack of resources, and education definitely is not on the higher side. For example, once a patient is diagnosed with the disease, it is so important that they comply with the drug therapy. So on one side, we have a lot of drugs that are already available in the market. There's a lot of evidence for those drugs that they can be effective in reducing recurrent events and all that. But then, because of education, because of lack of motivation, of understanding the importance of taking these medication, there is a lot of patients who are not really getting the goal-directed medical therapy that they should have been getting. And the other aspect is that if you look at let's say a city, many of the patients who are in and around the hospitals in the city, they have the opportunity to get life-saving interventions, which is not necessarily the case in those who are living in more hinterlands, especially in areas where there is no access to primary revascularization or other device procedures which we see for heart failure therapy. So which means that in India, countries like India, heart failure is not only a problem because of its growing incidence, but also because of the fact that we do not have enough resources at hand to tackle this issue. So it is an even bigger problem in a country like India. So we need more solutions for this than ever. Now, if you look at the investment, when it comes to investment in cardiovascular drug development, this is a field that has been stagnating over the past 2 decades, sadly. This is because the pharma industry, which we all know is like any other industry, looks at return on investment model always. And this return on investment model makes particularly cardiovascular drug development a very unattractive option. Other fields tend to be more lucrative, particularly fields like oncology. It is said that if you just look at the list of FDA approvals in between 2000 to 2020, 20 years, 2 decades of FDA approvals, you will see that almost the list will be filled with almost more than 50% of the drugs would be in the field of oncology. It is much more easier to develop a drug for oncology than to develop cardiovascular drugs. It appears that the pharma industry doesn't find cardiovascular.
Sorry to interrupt. You are not moving the slides, right? Somebody has
No, I'm not moving the slides.
Yeah. That's what, yeah.
It appears that the pharma industry seem to find cardiovascular development very unattractive. Now, when it comes to cardiovascular, now is it moving?
No, it's not moving.
Yes?
No, it's not moving, sir.
It's not moving. Okay, I'll stop sharing. Is it moving?
No.
No?
No.
Okay. I'll just try to unlog and log in again.
Sure, sir. No problems.
Is it okay now?
Share your screen. Please share your screen.
Okay, I'm not shared still. Okay.
Requesting all participants to please wait. Don't mind this hiccups.
Can you see, sir?
Yeah, it is visible. Screen is visible. Can you try scrolling your slides?
Yeah, I'm scrolling it.
It's not moving. I think the presenter mode is a problem. So why don't you come out of presenter mode for a moment? Don't close your PowerPoint.
Okay, fine. So now you are able to see, sir?
Yeah, the screen is visible. Can you just, yeah, now it is moving. Yeah.
It's moving. Okay.
Yeah.
Fine.
Please continue, sir. Yeah, thank you.
Fine. You're able to see, right? Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, so when it comes to investment in cardiovascular drug development, it has stagnated over the past. I'm sorry for this technical glitch. So when it comes to investment in cardiovascular drug development, there has been a lot of stagnation over the past 2 decades because the pharma industry, one of the reasons is the pharma industry has not found cardiovascular development as attractive as other areas like oncology. We'll try to see this in more detail. Now, when it comes to cardiovascular trials, one of the major challenges is the huge expense involved in conducting cardiovascular clinical trials. Now, why is this particularly so? This is because the current regulatory bodies, they stipulate that when it comes to evaluating drugs, phase 2 or phase 3, particularly when you're talking about phase 3 trials, they demand that we have to evaluate the drug for its direct benefit, okay, and risk. Now, what do you mean by that? It means that they are very particular that we use hard endpoints, hard cardiovascular endpoints, rather than using biomarkers or other suitable surrogates. So if you say that a clinical trial, the primary endpoint should be a hard clinical endpoint and not a soft endpoint like a biomarker, what will happen is that the company would have to show with their phase 3 clinical trial that the new drug really has the ability to reduce the mortality, for instance, mortality, okay, or heart failure hospitalizations, or recurrent myocardial infarction, any of these significant major adverse cardiovascular events, the pharmaceutical company would have to show that these events, cardiovascular events, should have been substantially reduced after taking the test molecule in comparison with the standard therapy that is in the other group or control population. Now, this becomes the biggest challenge. And genomic technology, systems biology approaches, we have been having this for a while. But then, and this has even contributed to new cardiovascular drug targets. But it has not correspondingly led to increasing drug approvals. For instance, you can see here this figure. It talks about probability of success in phase 2. Now, if you see probability of success in phase 2 in different fields, you can see hematology seems to be very successful. 48% chance of success is there. That means almost 50% of drugs in hematology would succeed if it goes through phase 2 trials. Let's look at cardiovascular. It is 21%, meaning almost only 1/4 of the drugs are going to go through when it comes to cardiovascular. And when it comes to phase 3, it is almost coming to only 55%, whereas hematology would come to almost 75%. So literally 50%, or you can say almost half the drugs that come even to phase 3 end up failing. And that too, when you're talking about cardiovascular phase 3 trials, it is large, gigantic clinical trials, because many times the sample size would exceed numbers like 5,000 and 10,000. We were part of a study where the sample size was 18,000, the global sample size. So such large sample sizes, when such studies are carried out, and at the end, if you're going to say that this molecule is not going to succeed, it is a tremendous loss of investment. Okay, and whichever firm that is investing will end up burning a big hole in their financial numbers. So when it comes to phase 1 trials, also cardiovascular seems to be again down in the list, only 4% likelihood of approval, whereas hematology and metabolic infectious disease seem to have much better rate. So of course in phase 1 there are more chance of failure, but even there when you compare with other drugs, it seems to be lost. So be it phase 1, be it phase 2, or be it phase 3, it appears that cardiovascular seems to be much more harder than other disease areas, and that is what the statistics are telling. So let's look at some of the other challenges in cardiovascular drug development. So it is so important, it has been told time and again that to avoid the challenges that happen with respect to failures, if there is early in-depth discussions between industry colleagues and regulatory agencies, so that they are able to understand what exactly is expected of them when it comes to taking the molecule forward, and how best the endpoints can be chosen so that we are most likely to develop and see some substantial benefit in the treatment. Cardiovascular drug development pipeline, if you look at the last 10 years, it is hardly we see any success story, except the PCSK9 inhibitors and SGLT2 inhibitors, and again, valsartan and sacubitril combination. There is not much worth talking about in recent times. Regulatory uncertainty is also very, very high when it comes to cardiovascular drug development. And several examples, we all know the stories that have happened in the past of how drugs which have received regulatory approval, and subsequently in post-marketing stage, it is found to have more harms. And as a result of that, it had to be withdrawn. And because of that, there is a lot of agencies which are strictly public activist agencies, which are strictly looking at these things to see that it doesn't repeat. And so there is a lot of public scrutiny as well as governmental scrutiny. So the regulatory approval process is obviously going to be much tougher. When it comes to companies which companies with oncology, infectious disease product have appeared in the last 10 years to have greater acquisitions, and almost they are able to double the money that they spent in terms of acquisitions than CV products. So even venture capitalists seem to have an aversion, a very low risk appetite when it comes to cardiovascular research, drug development programs. Even many times when they try to raise funding for research, somehow the competitor for cardiovascular disease is oncology always, because oncology, there is, if you just take a random survey, and this has been done, even there have been surveys to state this, like if anyone asks a random audience of 1,000 people, what is the disease that you're most scared about? Chances are they will tell it is cancer. But the reality is that cardiovascular disease is far, far more common than most of the cancers even combined. That is what the data says. But still, people are more scared about cancer. And as a result of that, the drive to develop funding by public advocacy groups for cancer is so high that they're able to successfully get a lot of funding when it comes to cancer research. That is not the case. We do not have that strong advocacy groups globally for cardiovascular drug development, and that significantly prevents attractive funding. Investors are also, these days, what studies have said, that they are willing to accept a lower return of interest in exchange for low risk of drug development failure, meaning they would rather have a drug that does not earn so much like a blockbuster, but has a greater chance of success, than go for a so-called blockbuster, but which has a high risk of failure. Okay, so low risk appetite is what we would say the technical term for this kind of investment, and that is what is seen these days with many of the firms, investors, venture capitalists, angel investors. So all this is leading to CV drug development getting really stagnant. Cardiovascular drug failures following pivotal registrations most often result from lack of commercial viability rather than safety or efficacy issues. For example, this failure of commercial viability could be because the company is expecting a higher cost rise or a revenue fall because of probable increased competition from rival products. They do something called as a futility analysis, and they sometimes to come to the conclusion that, okay, this drug, even if it succeeds and it passes regulatory agency approval, will it really be able to make a big difference in the market? If not, then many times, even at phase 2, the drug dies a natural death. Testing suggests that sometimes the target profile should be narrowed. Now, we all know that every pharmaceutical firm would like to see their product not very focused on a subpopulation, but rather a product that is suitable for all populations. So if they're feeling that this more tests, when they do more tests, when they do more evaluations, they find that this drug is actually not going to be beneficial for all populations, but rather only a small subpopulation who's going to really get the benefit, then that is not commercially viable anymore. Pharmaceutical firms in such cases will prefer abandoning these cardiovascular programs, and many times these are more of strategic reasons of abandoning in terms of their company profiling rather than the molecule per se being good or bad. So the point I'm trying to drive home is that it is not necessarily that every failure is a true efficacy or safety failure. Many of the failures are only because of supposedly holding on to the fact that this is not going to really have a big market. So the commercial viability is very low as perceived by the company. And the another thing is, of course, if you look at the West, the payment for all these drugs comes from the insurance agencies. They are the payers, especially in the West. In India, of course, it's a different scenario. Many times it's from the patient's own pocket. But in the West, since the insurance agencies are the one which are paying, they demand that, even they are demanding that large trials should be able to be showing that with adequate power to show really that this drug has a significant difference in clinical outcomes in order to get the drug approved. And even physicians, of course, always are the same. They would also demand evidence. Maybe that is why it is always you've seen that any big drug, if it is having to get launched, it needs to get approved in a journal like NEJM or JAMA, or Lancet, such big journals, if physicians are going to take the drug very, very seriously. And regulatory agencies, of course, are going to demand large trials with adequate power. So the challenge is to show that this drug, using a large clinical trial, can really prove a beneficial effect in comparison to the control population. I had alluded to this fact earlier that the progression of cardiovascular disease to its hard natural history outcome, that is, a patient who has cardiovascular disease today, that is, maybe he has, let's say, coronary artery disease, but he's stable. Now we have a drug which claims that this drug will prevent a patient from getting an acute MI. Okay, so from CAD, which is stable, to developing an acute MI is not something that will happen within 1 month. Maybe today he has CAD and he has stable CAD, and maybe it might take 2 years for him to develop an MI, or it may take 3 years for him to develop, or even it might take 5 years for him to develop an MI. So the point is, it takes time for cardiovascular disease to progress. So when you're having a clinical trial, and most of the cardiovascular clinical trials, the endpoint, the assessment is for a period of 5 years. So it might take such a long time for them to develop the event, and sometimes even after 5 years, the event might not develop. So this is the biggest challenge when it comes to cardiology, and that is why these days, not these days, for a long time, cardiovascular trials are always using composite endpoints. They don't look at just one event like death, but they use multiple cardiovascular events pooled together as composite endpoint of major adverse cardiovascular event. So any cardiovascular event is considered an event of significance. And but even for that, for a patient to go from the stable phase to this endpoint, it might take time. That is why cardiovascular trials are prolonged. That is why cardiovascular trials need to have large samples so that you have enough number of events to demonstrate that our drug is better than the control drug. There is another reason that cardiovascular trials are very difficult to carry out, and that is when you look at cardiovascular patients, we all know that most of patients, if you go anywhere, even in India, if you go anywhere, any hospital, and you see a patient with, say, ischemic heart disease, he is going to have aspirin, he's going to have clopidogrel, or just aspirin, he's going to take a beta blocker, he's going to be taking a diuretic, he's going to be taking spironolactone, he's going to be taking ACE inhibitor. So invariably he's going to be having multiple drugs needing for his condition, which is standard practice. Now, these drugs are already shown to have improvement in cardiovascular outcomes by several large clinical trials, already proven through many trials more than 2-3 decades before. Now, it appears that we have reached a kind of saturation point. So it is very difficult now for a patient, for us to demonstrate that the new drug which we are adding to this existing 5-6 drugs can improve the patient's outcomes even better. Okay, it appears we have reached that ceiling point where we might find it more challenging to go beyond this ceiling, and that is why it becomes challenging to see many of the drugs going through phase 3 trials when they are given along with existing standard of care. Many times they do not really show a substantial benefit to the control because already it appears to have reached a ceiling. Okay, and when these people are on this best background medical therapy, that itself is going to lower the event rate. So that will make the need for a larger sample size. Only then you can get enough number of events to show that less number of events have occurred in the test group and compared to control group. And this would mean that the trial will become more costly for obvious reasons and for longer duration. Now let's look at surrogate endpoints in cardiology. Now, blood pressure and low density lipoprotein levels, okay, they have served as very good surrogate endpoints for many of the important clinical major adverse cardiovascular outcomes. And this has been validated also through multiple clinical trials involving thousands of patients that lowering the blood pressure is equivalent to improvement in cardiovascular outcome. Meaning, if I give patients a drug which lowers the BP by 10 millimeter mercury, it translates to reduction of the chances of cardiovascular mortality by this much percentage. So these all things have been proven. Okay, same is true with LDL. If I lower my LDL levels by this much milligram per deciliter, it is going to translate into improved cardiovascular outcomes. These all have been well known surrogate endpoints and it's been validated. So for example, there is this trial called Improve It trial, which showed that LDL lowering with combination of ezetimibe and simvastatin in comparison with simvastatin alone had improved clinical outcome. This was the trial which pushed them to develop the novel anti-hyperlipidemic medication to push this lipid lowering down to even more lower levels and that is how PCSK9 inhibitors came into the market. So PCSK9 inhibitor, we know it's alirocumab, evolocumab. They came out somewhere in the middle of 2015 and 16. And if you look at these drugs, initially they were approved for the treatment of familial hypercholesterolemia, that is in people who have extremely high levels of cholesterol because of genetic deficiencies, mutations. They had a very high risk of developing cardiovascular disease, and so it was initially approved for those group of patients. But subsequently, they have tried to also do studies to show that this drug, alirocumab and even evolocumab, if it could be given to patients, okay, who, in spite of taking statins, are having LDL that is high, that is 100 plus, okay, and if you bring that LDL down to 70 or less than 70, it could result in a higher chance of a patient having less cardiovascular outcome. This was their hypothesis, and they went about doing a cardiovascular long-term outcome study, which we were part of, and this study also took almost four plus years, and finally they were able to demonstrate that this drug actually works. Alirocumab, if you give in post-acute coronary syndrome patients, it will improve the cardiovascular mortality. It will reduce the cardiovascular mortality. So based on this, the FDA has reviewed the documents, reviewed the data, and they have also added this as an additional indication in the label. So labeling change happened. But after that, what we saw was, of course, this drug had a cost issue, and as a result of that, it did not become a big major change. It did not affect the Indian cardiovascular market much. But if you look at the American market, where the payer was the insurance company, what we saw was a reluctance of the insurance agencies to approve this drug from being prescribed by the physicians. Okay, there very often used to be a lot of hassles for a patient to get this particular drug. Okay, so for this I need to explain the mathematics behind this. See, if you look at cardiovascular disease, it is a disease which affects millions. Okay, this is different from other diseases like cancer and the other diseases which I have shown, where the prevalence is not so high. So if you are bringing a drug for cardiovascular disease, and if it is going to be something that is going to have a cost in it, obviously this will become a huge inhibiting factor for an insurance company to start paying, because every second patient or every third patient would probably having a need for these medication. So in contrast, when it comes to cancers or other diseases, the kind of prevalence we are seeing is not as high as what we see with cardiovascular disease. So even though this oncology drugs are also costly, it becomes more viable for them to really support this medication. And that is why oncology industry today is a very big industry. It is said in almost more than even 10 years back, it was $67 billion was the kind of sale value that the oncology drugs had for just 1 year. Okay, so these are the real challenges that are there in developing cardiovascular drugs. And now I was coming back to surrogate endpoints. I told you a success story, okay, but it is not that surrogate endpoints have always found to be beneficial. Alpha blockers, we all know it will lower blood pressure, okay, but there have been studies when they try to see if you give alpha blocker, will it reduce cardiovascular events? They found that it appeared to not have that benefit. Okay, so that is why alpha blockers as such, though it can reduce the blood pressure, its ability to reduce cardiovascular outcomes, to reduce cardiovascular disease, is not as high as what we see with diuretics and beta blockers, okay, and ACE inhibitors. There was this drug called torcetrapib. okay, and even niacin. These are all drugs which shown to have good ability to increase the HDL cholesterol. Okay, but when they have done studies to see the cardiovascular benefits, multiple large trials were done and all turned out to be failure. In fact, even it also had additional harmful effects also, and that is why they had to abandon torcetrapib for further drug development. And we also know the story of how class 1C antiarrhythmic drugs, when they were given to patients in the post-MI period, they thought that giving them to post-MI patients will be useful because it can suppress the premature ventricular contractions, PNCs, okay, PVCs. But what was happening is, okay, giving antiarrhythmics can reduce the PVCs, but then at what cost is it coming? It is coming at the cost of increased risk of death. Okay, in fact, this is the classic example where we find that surrogate endpoints extremely successful, but the major outcome, which is death, it was a big failure. Okay, so the point, the story, what we are trying to tell here is that surrogate endpoints, it might work in some instances, but there are lots of stories to say how surrogate endpoints have miserably failed. So we cannot always rely on surrogate endpoints, particularly in the field of cardiology. What about other fields? Again, if I have to talk about the instance of oncology, oncology is also a field where ideally there should be a drug should show benefit in terms of improvement in overall survival. Okay, that is the ideal endpoint. But many times we see that in oncology also, drugs are being approved on the basis of surrogate endpoints like progression-free survival. Many drugs in oncology have obtained approval through improvement in endpoints like progression-free survival, which is actually a surrogate endpoint rather than a hard endpoint. Surrogate endpoints do not fully predict the true balance of risk and benefit of intervention. So that's what I was saying. So we have to take it with a pinch of salt. There appears to, if there is an incomplete coupling between the biomarker that we are of having interest and the clinical outcome, and there is some unknown, unintended pharmacological action of the intervention, then it could turn out to be that surrogate endpoint is really not very useful. So then where exactly can we use this? Okay, probably surrogate endpoints could be more useful in using and identifying a population who is more likely to benefit from the disease, benefit from the drug, and to sometimes possibly identify biological targets and also drive research to identify good suitable targets. So for biomarker research for drug discovery and for enriching populations in clinical trials, there may be, to improve the efficiency of drug development as a whole, it could be useful to use surrogate endpoints. For example, there was this trial called companion trial. This companion trial is basically a trial which compared medical therapy versus pacing versus defibrillation in patients with heart failure. So what they proved, they were able to show that there was a 20% reduction in all-cause mortality or hospitalization among people receiving chronic resynchronization therapy. Okay, but if you notice this trial, they have only included people who had a QRS interval that was above 120 milliseconds. They had not taken all patients with heart failure. As a result of that, they have been able to show that this particular therapy is useful. Another example, the Jupiter trial, you all know very well. This is a trial which showed rosuvastatin's benefit. They were able to show that rosuvastatin can reduce major adverse cardiovascular events. And if you look at the population they have selected, they took only people who had elevated C-reactive protein. Okay, so again, another example of using enriched population in a clinical trial. So we definitely need to identify new biological signatures. using this genome-wide association studies, next-generation sequencing, proteomics, metabolomics. The tools have improved to identify newer targets. So we cannot do away with all these things. There have been failures, but yes, probably in the days to come, we might be seeing more targets through all these studies. And trials must also be sufficiently large to detect small differences in mortality and other outcomes, so that whatever outcome improvement you see is beneficial to the individual and society. When trials are large, what happens is monitoring also becomes very cumbersome. As a result of that, that will all add to the cost, more sites, more monitoring. So priority should be given to use optimal data collection, and also to use as much as remote monitoring as possible. Use these days we have a lot of devices that could be used which could collect data. Wearable devices are there, and there has been a lot of discussion on this. The problem is these have not been standardized, but probably in the days ahead we can see standardization of these wearables and devices. As of now, most of the devices that are available in the market are more for use, like you can go, if you're going for a walk, you want to take a device to measure your heart rate and all that, it's fine. But then clinical trials, we're talking about serious issues here. It's about life and death. It's about collecting valuable data which is going to decide the fate of a drug, whether it's going to be useful in curing a disease and treating a disease. So we need very standard devices that have some minimum standards that are universally acceptable. As of now, we don't have such kind of standards, and we can expect these things to happen in the very near future. And limit the recording of less impactful adverse and serious adverse events. See, when you are doing clinical trials, you will realize that a lot of work is done just because it is a norm. It has to be done, and that documentation has to be followed. And we realize that sometimes there could be changes in certain documentations to reduce the amount of data that is collected, so that we spend more important time on important things. Big firms should continue to strive to improve trial efficiency and emphasize meaningful clinical outcomes. Streamline risk-based and remote monitoring. It should be the need of the hour. In 2013, BMS company, they had acquired a particular company called Myocardia. Okay, that was in 2000, almost 10 years back. And last year, this news came out that this particular company, which was basically a company which was looking at cardiomyopathy, they were evaluating different mutations for cardiomyopathy, and they were able to identify who are the subset of patients who are most likely to respond to this drug called mavacamten. Okay, and subsequently they have done the clinical trials, and in 2022 they were able to get the FDA approval for this drug called mavacamten in the treatment of hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. The story why I'm telling is to show that the time has come for us, for companies, to use smart strategies and technologies, that the trials that they do are optimally designed so that we have highest chance of success. It is also important to leverage academic collaborations and novel and governmental agencies using the programs that are already existing, as well as identify the new programs, so that you can de-risk and reduce the chance of failures and develop potential targets through this drug development, early phase and late phase. The bottom line is to avoid working in silos. That's what I'm trying to say. So with this, I'll stop, and I will probably try to discuss and answer questions if there are any.
It's completed, is it, Melvin sir?
Yeah.
Yeah. So now people can ask questions. So audience, you can ask questions if you want. Or even you can type in the chat box so I can read out the questions. No questions, so we'll wrap it up.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for your fantastic talk, because it's something that is very rare to see people speak on these cardiovascular trials. We all think that cardiovascular trials are easy, but the actual thing, it's not easy. That's what the takeaway message is. And you gave several examples and user stories on that. Fantastic it was. Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you,
Melvin.
sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.